welcome to today's episode of Family Tree Talk. My name's Helen, I'm editor of Family Tree, and with me as usual is...
Nathan Ward, hello there.
And we have a very special guest, and it's Dr Mike Esbester, who's Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Portsmouth and Head of the Railway Work, Life and Death Project. And I'm going to speak to him about that project in a little bit. But first we're going to catch up with some, very exciting news about this momentous year in railway history, because it's Railway 200, isn't it? So that's the 200th anniversary of the modern railway. But Mike, can you tell us, what does this mean? Like, what is the modern railway? What happened 200 years ago that should get us so excited?
Great, thanks both. This is really great. I love Railway 200 because this is a wonderful opportunity to see railway history really public. I mean, people in the UK in particular, but worldwide, love a bit of railway history, and that's wonderful. I'm all for that. But what's really great about this is just the sheer volume of events and public interpretation activities that are taking place to mark the anniversary. It's basically it's a really interesting time because yes, we can draw a starting point. We can say, right, Stockton Darlington Railway, 27th of September, 1825. It's the first public passenger steam-hauled railway journey. Now, people question that because, of course, nothing just comes out of nowhere. There's been lots of developments that take us to Stockton Darlington in 1825. People point back to the technological side of things, so the early development of the steam engine as a static thing, and then into it as a mobile thing. So we think about Richard Trevithick, Timothy Hackworth, and George Stephenson, and some of these early pioneers of the technological side of things, which is all really important. But what's really, I think, fundamental and kind of exciting, different about 1825 is that's when it starts to get the public notice, gain traction, as it were. And really kind of start moving forwards. You get to 1830 and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, really the first kind of modern intercity railway, so between two defined cities that are really, really big, and it's both designed with passenger and freight transport in mind. So there's an awful lot going on that's building on earlier developments, and from that point then, the potential is demonstrated for steam railways, and it's a kind of a great demonstration that people can really grasp and kind of start to see the potential for and take off.
And I think what's quite exciting about this era is this dramatic pace of change. And from mine and Nathan's point of view as family historians, so imagining our ancestors' worlds, just how transformative it was from the very early 1800s and then through, in somebody's lifetime, they're just watching the landscape around them change, the soundscape, all of it.
Yeah, that's really brilliant as well. I love that idea about the landscape and the soundscape. So that is, thinking about it, it's a dramatic change, what's being done. And people were talking about it in those terms at the time as well, about the conquering nature, which is both seen as a positive and something to be quite worried about in some quarters. What's quite amusing, as you had with the canal building previously, large landowners not really wanting this newfangled technology crossing their territory or being visible to them. So where they do kind of graciously allow it across their territory at vast cost to the railway companies, they also, some of them, build in clauses about disguising it so you can't really see it from their property, and it's not really intruding on their lives in that way. So it's got a really interesting contrast there, but it is definitely having a huge impact on, I'm not going to say every single aspect of people's lives, but many aspects of people's lives. And that's a really important thing. I talked about the technological side of things and kind of building from early wagon ways to steam haul traction. So that's really important. Of course it is. You can't have it without technology, but fundamentally it's got to do something. It's got to do something for people. And so it's whether it's moving people, whether it's moving goods, whether it's moving mail and newspapers, and so on. So it's there to serve a purpose. So to focus on the technology is on one level important, of course, but actually the social and cultural impact of the railways in the from 1825 onwards is really important. And if people didn't go for it, these things wouldn't have flourished. So thinking about the people behind them and using them and working on them, of course, is really important.
I mean, I love, as many family historians do, looking at old maps, and you can really see the development of railways as you scroll back through time. And Nathan, I don't know, you've looked at some maps, haven't you, with your family history? So Nathan's kind of a fairly newbie family historian, been doing it for about 6 months, and he is excellent at being thorough. But I don't know how many maps you've looked at, but it's always a delight to see railways marked on the maps and kind of get a sense, imagine the steam trains going past your ancestors' homes. Have you looked at many maps? Have you kind of come across any railway connections yet in your family history?
I haven't done any map stuff really, which is weird because I also really love a good map. But yeah, obviously the freedom of movement that trains give is quite an interesting thing to think about. Because again, my family history is very local, but the trains must be where it starts, where you can suddenly see people moving about more, and it becomes a trickier thing to do, doesn't it?
Well, that's really interesting. Again, this idea about lots of people do use the railways, and we're up in the kind of the millions of journeys very quickly in the 1840s, 1850s. So there's no doubt about it, people take it. But also, not everyone does move, whether that's, in terms of work, life, whatever. So some people do remain the same. This is what I mean when I say railways, they have a huge impact, but they don't necessarily affect everyone instantly and that dramatically. What's really interesting, I think, is again this idea about the potential, and that freedom of circulation for not just people, but news and ideas. So on one level, it does broaden people's horizons just by virtue of being there. I'm trying to think, it might be apocryphal. I've been trying to pin down for some time, but I'm sure I remember seeing a discussion about a railway being welcomed into the village that it was coming through with a banner saying "Hail, Steam, the Civilizer." It's just a kind of a wonderful take on the cultural impact and how these things were viewed by some people.
It's really fun. So, I mean, is there other evidence? It may be hard to come by of people being terrified of it. There are newspaper reports, presumably, of the early kind of advent of rail coming to new communities and what the locals thought about it.
So I was thinking a little bit about this ahead of this podcast, and it's really difficult not to concentrate on the earlier era. So the kind of 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when the railway's new, because you do get such extreme, really interesting reactions to it, from those people who are real proponents and advocates for it. And again, there's a lot of that, partly kind of boosterism to try to sell the idea. But there's also, real concern. People don't know what to make of it. And medically, there's questions that are raised, for example, about the effect of traveling through tunnels. Is all the air going to be pushed out of the tunnels and the carriages, and people are going to suffocate in these things with the speed that they're traveling? Because of course we're moving a lot faster now than previously. So there are question marks about the effects of railway travel on people's bodies, as well as concerns about the kind of the social disorder that they may bring. One of the things about landowners being concerned about what's happening on their territory was the hoi polloi passing through. And when you get to Chartism in the late 1830s into the 1840s, railways are used there to move troops and police around what's then kind of the network as it then exists to where they think there may be trouble and hotspots. So you get the railways being used in very different ways for very kind of effective social concerns across this period.
And is there evidence of the protesters, such as the Chartists, using the railways to get around as well?
Well, of course, that's the flip side is, these are private concerns. They're paying things, so they want customers. So if people are going to pay to get to somewhere, A to B, and at B just happens to be a demonstration, then the private companies aren't going to say no to it in that sense. So yes, people would have used the railways to move around. And, as I say, the idea about speaking tours, whether it's famous authors or Chartist protesters, what have you, they needed to get from A to B, and the quickest and most efficient way of doing that nowadays, or at that point, was very much the railway. So people would have used the system such that it was to get around to do all these sorts of things.
Mike, I'm going to put you on the spot, and it doesn't matter if you don't know the answers, or maybe you do know the answers. Maybe so. This is like lots of infrastructure and lots of things getting built. And do you have any facts and figures about how many miles of railway were built through, say, the Victorian period or whatever, or how many tunnels, or the longest tunnel, or dramatic things which happened, which for people like me and Nathan who aren't railway experts, kind of those just quirky little facts?
Yeah, so there's all sorts. I mean, there's infrastructure stuff. So you get to height of the network just around the time of the First World War, and we're looking at something a bit shy of 19,000 route miles across, I'm going to say Britain rather than the UK. So it's extensive, and obviously it's been building up to that point. It declines thereafter. there's the kind of the social side of things. So there are, thinking about the fears that were raised, particularly in the construction era. And the construction era, really, the major construction era, we'd think about the 1840s into the 1850s, some in the 1860s. And there's bits thereafter, but you're looking at quite a lot of the network's been built by the time you get into the 1870s. But navvies, the people who built the canals, they're a transient workforce, are often seen as being kind of disreputable and disruptive. Vast encampments at particular locations where they're needed, and they are often around things like tunnels where you do need a big labour force. But they're kind of here today, gone tomorrow almost. So there's no tie to community, and again, this idea about community is really important. So there are complete concerns there, and again, there's a class factor, of course, involved in this, in these disruptive working class types. Even of the lower working classes, seen as something by some people to be fearful of. So you get real concerns, real tensions within communities at certain kind of flash points where the building and construction is taking place, but they tend to be short lived. So there's really interesting things that get us to obviously the hard facts, the infrastructure stuff, but also those social tensions and concerns that occur.
Definitely.
Understandable.
I've got an ancestor, and you've completely put him in context. So I knew he came over from Ireland, and I first found him in the 1851 census working as a labourer. It doesn't actually say navvy, but he's definitely not an agricultural labourer, from other evidence I found. And so him and his brother are working there in Scotland, and they're right in the peak of the railways getting built. So I always suspected it would be railways or something like that. And then that kind of makes more sense. That's their perfect time frame, and I don't know how welcome they would have been in the local community in Scotland, but they weren't alone. There's quite a lot of them, so maybe that doesn't even help. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, this is always a really interesting thing I think about this, about that social context. It's brilliant to be thinking that we can find the factual details about our ancestors through those documentary records, such as they are. They are quite scant. They'll tell you something, but it's where you can kind of then start to pin down or put them into that bigger picture that you get that sense of, okay, this might have been what it was like for them to be living and working in these contexts, doing these jobs, which it's difficult to pin down precisely very often, because unfortunately people didn't tend to write down or record in ways that survive, as you know, much about their lives. So where we can pick it up from other sources and infer and say, well, okay, it was like this for other people. We've got this evidence. It might well have been like this for my ancestor. I like that. That's pretty cool.
So with touching on navvies, that's one kind of very extreme end of the kind of logistics bit or the infrastructure bit of railways, and then going through actually working on the railways once they get built. Can you just give us a flavour, just like a chocolate box flavour, of all the different sorts of jobs that somebody might have done if they worked on something to do with the railway, from the top to the bottom and anything in between we might not have thought of?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a tough ask. I'll certainly give it.
It can be random. We'll just be delighted with anything, won't we, Nathan?
Yeah, definitely.
What's brilliant about the railways, the bigger railway companies did virtually everything themselves. Whether it is from kind of building the infrastructure, putting together the smallest components, manufacturing pencils, to manufacturing the steam engines themselves and the carriages and the wagons and so on. So there's everything that needed to do that. So you could have people who were working in the workshops, building the wagons and carriages and locos. Iron work as part of that. So massive furnaces and forges and so on. So really heavy industry, right through to the people that needed to keep the system moving. So we tend to probably think about the drivers and firemen, very much the kind of the glamorous, the labour aristocracy as they've been called. Although those jobs weren't that glamorous, they were quite mucky and not so much fun at times. But porters, guards, signalmen, they're cleaners, of course, and I mean, both local cleaners, but also office cleaners. You've got to keep the public-facing side of things tidy and attractive. You're selling a product after all. You've got the people who are doing the marketing. They're very much behind the scenes. The hotel staff, catering staff. You have railways have quite big shipping and docking industry interests. They own and operate both ships and docks themselves. So you have railway workers who are actually on board ships, and mentioned hotels, the people who are needed to keep the hotel service and the various railway carriage accommodation service, so cleaning staff, and again, quite a lot of women involved, both as seamstresses, but also in the cleaning side of things, so laundresses. In the 1930s, the railways branch into the air industry, so they operate an airline service. They've got road transport connections, so you might have people who were horse and cart, or later, railways were early users of electric vehicles, as well as conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. So, there's loads. Basically, you think of a job that someone might have had, and they've probably done it on the railways at some point.
Amazing. One of my 2 times great aunts, she was a railway clerk, and I felt really pleased for her because she's in the 1921 census and she's just down without a job. But anyway, by the time you work later through her life, through the 30s and 40s, she's become a railway clerk, and it's really good for her. It's obviously like a long-term job, and it improved her quality of your life a lot. And yeah.
So there's 2 things to pick up on that, I would say, is that idea about a long-term job. And this is it. The railways are really attractive to people, certainly in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, as a job, as a career, because they're stable, they're respectable, they have long-term prospects. You have to be vetted for entry, recommended by someone, letters of reference, a recommendation. So they're not just going to take on any old riffraff. And once you're in, though, provided you keep your copybook clean, you're in. And not only you, but potentially then any children you might have. So it's, you do see railway families running. So one of the nice things that's come out of Railway 200, there was a search for the longest serving railway family, and they found one of the families could trace themselves back to 1846 with a continuous line of railway employment. So it's no joke to say it does run in the family. So there's that side of things, and this idea that it's a good job and potentially a job for life, but also it offers opportunities for women as well. And we perhaps tend to think of the First World War or Second World War, and there's no doubt that in those patches, which are very much blips, there are more opportunities for women. But women were employed on the railways from the beginning. In roles that were typical and expected for women of the time. So I mentioned about the seamstresses and laundresses and so on. So they're still kind of within the social conventions, but they are employed. They're doing other things as well. You get quite a lot of women gatekeepers, so opening and closing the level crossing gates, which can be quite a dangerous role, unfortunately for them. So it's there's opportunities there for women's employment, and I think quite interestingly, there's opportunities for employment of people with disabilities. So some of those are occupationally caused. Unfortunately, the railways are quite dangerous places to work, but they then have a reasonable chance that the railway companies will keep someone on and find a new occupation. And I've certainly seen cases of people with pre-existing, so not caused by the railways, but pre-existing disabilities who are employed by the railways. So, I'm not going to paint a picture and say it was all wonderful. There were equal opportunities and fair play right from the outset. Of course they weren't. There were prejudices, as there were everywhere in society. But there were some opportunities, at least perhaps in ways that we might not expect.
I mean, Nathan, surely after listening to all of this, you've got to be super tempted that you're going to really hope you're going to find some railway ancestors, aren't you?
Definitely, yeah. If there's something that I can follow and track, that would be awesome, yeah. Are there any actual particular alternate records that you can do from the research for with regards to railways?
So, I mean, you've got all your standard stuff. So the census, birth, marriage, deaths, and so on. Newspaper records are really great, really interesting, as they are for many things, because, again, it's the kind of recording, particularly local newspapers, of the particular matters, so there and then. But, I mean, you've got the staff company, railway companies kept really good records because they had to. They kind of spread over vast distances. They're bureaucratic organisations. They need the paperwork to run. So where we got records that survive, staff registers particularly, are really, really useful, really interesting stuff. Sometimes they're kind of, they're quite, how to put this, minimal in their content. They'll tell you when someone was appointed at what station. I've been looking at some of these recently, and again, they'll give a person who's recommended them. But when you get kind of a series of those, it's really interesting. You can trace someone around the network. And again, I've done this recently with some work that I've been doing with a group local to me at Portsmouth, the Helen Local History Group. We're working together to try to find out a bit more about some of the railway workers in our area. And what's quite nice about this, again, thinking Railway 200, is that we're going to be putting together a kind of travelling exhibition and some posters that will go up in local stations that will tell people about some of these people. But I can think of one case where we traced a worker around the network, again, all within his company. So this is a kind of key thing if you are looking for our ancestors. Obviously, the standard stuff you'd hopefully have already, like a name, dates of birth, death, some rough idea of location. If you've got a railway company, that's really, really important, because the railway companies were kind of fierce rivals with each other, and they had their own territories. And sometimes they did talk about it, as if they were battling the other companies. But if you know the company, you can then kind of open up the records and they're right, we'll do the staff registers survive. If they do, they'll be at Kew at the National Archives. Some, but not all, have been digitized, and you can trace them around. And again, the thing about many railway workers is they're quite mobile. So not just those who are on the train, so the guards and the crews who are driving them, but workers were kind of at the behest of their employers. So if the employer said, right, particularly if you want promotion, you're going to need to move from where you are now to many miles away, the employee by and large does it. So they dot around the system. So knowing what their system is, where their network extends, that's really, really helpful in opening up both the staff registers, but also being able to trace and see their journey over a life course.
Thank you. Mike, so out of these records, do you have any idea what the survival rate for the records is? And also part of that is how many railway companies were there? What are the chances of me and Nathan, if we find some railway ancestors, the odds on or off?
Oh, yeah, jury's out, I'm afraid. So on one level, the odds are pretty good, because there were so many people employed. By the time of the First World War, we're looking at about 640,000 people being employed by the railways, and there are about 120 railway companies in the UK. So quite a lot. Some of them are quite big. So the Great Western Railway was employing 80,000 people at that sort of time. And there were larger companies as well. Some of them, quite small. With the bigger companies, more records, and for various reasons, there was a good chance of survival. But it is patchy, and we've got to remember that these records were being kept at the time as working documents for a particular purpose, effectively managing the people who were employed by the company. They weren't kept with us in mind now. So as I say, some of the records, they are quite unrevealing in many ways, but some of the records where you do get a fuller staff employment record, is brilliant, particularly for the footplate crews. So someone coming as a cleaner, but there's a fireman and then driver. And again, for the period that we're looking at, we are talking about all men who are doing those roles. Certainly firemen and driving the engines. There you get really interesting detail, particularly about their eyesight. You've got to be able to see signals, but also differentiate between colour, so red, green, or effectively. So the colour blindness is the thing. So you get regular eye checks, and you get those recorded in the register. You get where they've been moved, so where they've gone for promotion or to move for different jobs. You get records sometimes of any incidents that happen, both positive and negative. So whether it's an accident or whether they've done something spectacular and averted a problem, and it's been recognised. So they can be really, really interesting and kind of great insights into everyday life, where they survive. So that's the challenge.
So you touched a bit on this. You mentioned disasters, accidents, injuries, occupational hazards that they've had, and this kind of brings me really neatly onto kind of your reason for being, isn't it? And it's your project, the Railway Work, Life and Death Project. And I can't remember how many years you've been working on it now, but it's a long time. So could you kind of scroll us back to what on earth made you want to start doing this project? What was your starting point, and where it went from there? Who you've collaborated with, other organisations outside the university, things like that.
Yeah, brilliant. I'd be delighted to. So we started about 10 years ago, getting on for now. It's actually at a conference that was held in York at the National Railway Museum to bring together railway historians and family historians. And at that, I went along and spoke. So look, I know of this bunch of great records that exist. They're really, really interesting. They tell us stuff about how the railways worked, but they tell us stuff about the people who worked them. And they are accident records. would there be any interest if these were made more easily accessible, because they're only available in hard copy at a few locations. And I thought there probably would be, but people responded very positively. So great, okay, this is brilliant. How do we do this? And it just so happened that there was a volunteer team at the National Railway Museum who had just come into the end of one project, who were looking for another project to work on. So I leapt in there and said, "Oh, how about we do something on these accidents?" So we did a bit of a proof of concept, and worked on the volunteers, who are absolutely brilliant, as they have been throughout the project, and it couldn't be done without them. So full recognition and a massive thanks to them for the thousands of hours of work they put in across the board. We started with a trial run of about 4,000 records. It was always a remote project. This is a pre-COVID thing. So we scanned the records, these reports that were produced by the state accident investigators into railway worker accidents, and shared them with the volunteers, who then transcribed them. And we got to the end of the records quite quickly, and they said, "Right, where's the next lot?" So they were keen to carry on, and we released them, and people were using them and saying, "Oh, this is a really useful resource." But there's not very many of them. Well, okay, we can work on that, and it's gone from there. So we carried on working with the team at the National Railway Museum, and they're still hard at work now, transcribing more records. And we since then expanded to work with the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick, where they have trades union records. I should have mentioned that earlier, Nathan, when you asked about other record sources and so on. Trades union records are really, really interesting, really useful. So you get trades unions formed from the 1870s onwards, and they the minutes and kind of records of proceedings and so on are fascinating, again, from a social history context, from a political and labour history context. What they say about the records they keep about their members, in terms of the support that the union offers in the event of an accident, or actually old age or ill health as well, is really, really significant and interesting. But again, it was something that was locked up in the hard copies that were effectively only available at the Modern Record Centre. So we worked with the Modern Record Centre, and again, a small team of volunteers there, to transcribe those records, some of which we've released within the project already. So the project database now, which is a database of these transcriptions that the volunteers have been producing, runs to about 115,000 people. About 25,000 of those are trade union records, and we're polishing off the last half of them. So again, probably about another 25,000 records, maybe, bit of a guess. We don't know quite yet when we're going to release those, but there's more to come on those. But they're, again, really interesting about what the union does to look after its members. And what's brilliant about this as well is that the key union there is the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants, which becomes the National Union of Railwaymen, which is now the RMT. And the RMT have been really supportive and absolutely fascinated by their own history, which I think is a really, really positive sign. They've been very supportive of what we've been doing with the project in terms of taking it into the railway industry, which is again, really a big outcome for us. So trade union records. And then the most recent records that we've been dealing with have been those produced by the railway companies themselves, and they're held at the National Archives at Kew. So they cover England and Wales. So Scottish records up in Edinburgh, and Northern Irish records such that exist, I think, at Prony. So we've got kind of this batch of records that the railway companies produced in England and Wales about accidents to their workforce from 1855. So I think the earliest we're going to go back through to 1929 for that one of records. Most of them are concentrated in kind of around 1900 to 1920. But we talk about over 69,000 records there. Again, fascinating, really fascinating detail. And what's great, I think, is when we can now do this thanks to the Railway Life and Death Project's database, triangulate between the same person who appears in a state accident investigators report, a trade union record, and the railway company record. And we can get something slightly different from them, see some slightly different points of view about what might have happened, which is really revealing.
Nathan, I was lucky enough to see some of these records recently, and what really struck me was two things. One is that really tiny accidents are getting reported. Like in my rather dramatic mind, the accidents that were getting reported would be somebody's arm getting crushed between like some couplings, something like that. But it's not. Most of them are people have cut their finger or done really small things, and it made me think, "Oh, is this really a drama? Would you really put it in an accident book?" And then one of the other historians who was there explained it to me, saying that in an era before antibiotics, a little cut on the finger could soon turn into a massive medical drama. And so you needed to take, in a way, we always say that health and safety is kind of a modern thing, but in a way you had to take almost more care of yourself in the past because the stakes were so high if you did get ill. And it was tied into that. It was they explained about how there wasn't the welfare state, there wasn't any sick pay. So it's really important that your boss pays out some money while you recover from your injury. I just love that, Mike. What do you think, Nathan?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. It's again, I'm admittedly not very good at history, but it just makes you think and realize how easy we've got things now. And then, yeah, just to paint some texture into these people's lives, it's brilliant.
Yeah,
Amazing numbers as well.
yeah. I mean, completely on I mean, penicillin in terms of septicemia, blood poisoning, is an absolute game changer. And for exactly, Helen, as you said, those reasons about why these things are being recorded, so that partly it is so you can see that things are being dealt with, but also if something should happen, then there is a record and it can be worked out. The root cause, what went wrong, how long someone should get some sort of help for, and so on. But also, as you just said, this idea nowadays, about 15 years ago, there was a lot of rhetoric going around about, health and safety gone mad. And, when people stop and think about that, actually, it's generally speaking, it's not a problem. And, fundamentally, what's wrong with the idea that people should be able to live and work in, a healthy environment in a safe way and go home safe at the end of the job? There's nothing wrong with that as a principle. In fact, everything to be said for it. It's when you look back at some of these records, you think, wow, the railways admittedly were a dangerous workplace, but even so, the other dangerous workplaces as well, construction, agriculture, shipping, mining, factory work as well. So there's all sorts of 19th into the early 20th century. It was a pretty rotten time to live in many ways, and not much fun for those who are doing some really hard manual labor and some really dangerous stuff. So what's great about these records is exactly as you just said, the color it gives. We can see so much detail about people's lives that are coming out of these records. It's on one level, the project Railway Life and Death, we're looking at railway accidents, railway worker accidents. It's really niche, but actually, when you get into the detail that's in there, this is a social history project. It's much wider. It's much broader than just thinking about this kind of single moment in someone's life where they had an accident, or in the case of some people, as we can see, where they had more than one accident. I haven't done a full tally yet, but from the records that we've got, I've certainly found workers who've had, and several workers who've had well over 10 accidents in their working career. But again, it gives a kind of flavour of that. But it tells us other things. The records tell us other things about things like how much they're being paid, the sorts of work that they were doing, in some cases where they were living. And you can it's one piece of the puzzle. And that's one of the things we'd always hoped from the project, was that it would give people a bit more information about people's working lives and about a particular moment or moments in those lives that they then would be able to fit in with what they know about that person and about their life. So what we found really productive and really rewarding, I think, as a project, has been where we've had people get in touch with us to say, I found my great-grandfather, great-uncle, whoever it might be, in the records. We didn't know about the accident or didn't know any detail about the accident. Now we do. And this is what the person was like in life, or what's come down to us through the family tales. So we then start to see something a bit about the person behind the official document. And that's really wonderful. And that can only happen in that very collaborative way. So it's really, I love it when it happens. It's amazing.
I love it though. It's almost like when you're looking through a telescope or something and you're focusing in or out. So from mine and Nathan's point of view, we're super focused on the individual person, but we always, don't we, Nathan? We always love it when we broaden out the view and put their life in context. And then you're coming it from another point of view. You're coming from maybe a broad social historian's point of view, and then zooming in on individual lives to actually bring the social history to life and make it very personal, having those individual case studies. It's suddenly not just a big old boring act of parliament or a big ledger of state papers. Suddenly, direct impact on one person's life.
Yeah, really that. It's amazing. The numbers were known at the time. They were made publicly available, and they were in the newspapers every year when the annual report came out and said, this year there have been 29,713 accidents that have involved injury to railway workers. That's 1913, actual figure. But it's a number. It's a huge number. It's too big to deal with. Whereas when you get it down to one person and say, okay, well, in June 1907, William Parry was a porter at Bargoes railway station in Wales, and he was crossing the line with his father, who also worked for the railway, as did many other of his family members. And William, the son, was hit by a train, and he lost a leg as a result of that accident. And you can see that you can start to get some sense of how devastating, how challenging that must have been for the whole family. He then crops up later on and this again tells us so much about society of its time. In 1911, he has another accident. He falls over whilst he is dusting his signal box because he'd been kept on by the railway company and re-employed as a signalman, something he can do with one leg. That the disability is no impediment to his ability to perform that task. So, we've got this kind of single moment that actually the ripples you can see much more widely, and it gives us that we can see that person, we can understand them as an individual in a community, and part of a kind of a much wider life course, rather than just being one of however many thousand that year.
It's romanticizing as well, doesn't it? Because if you see in a piece of paper that worked on the railways, you can just blanket make up this life for them where they're jetting about and it's awesome and it's all great. If you can really focus on the individual tasks, it just changes your perspective a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And it's really interesting, this one, because very often from our perspective as the Railway Work, Life and Death Project, the stories we're telling are difficult ones in that they're, generally speaking, I'm very pleased when someone finds something of value in it, particularly if they find an ancestor in what we've been doing. On the other hand, I'm not pleased because it means generally something bad has happened to their ancestor. Again, as you said, many of these cases are quite minor. Sometimes they are quite severe, but it does give that perspective to think, well, actually, we do tend to romanticize things now. And it's been a bit of an interesting path to tread in terms of Railway 200. And one of the key, some of the key kind of aspects is they're thinking about past, present, and future. So they're very keen to think about the positives and about the potential for people going into the railway industry now. And that's it's brilliant. I'm all in support of that. Absolutely, railway is the way forward in environmental terms, as in many others. But it's I was a bit concerned. There's a bit of a tension here, and how's this going to go down with the difficult bits that I want to focus on, the project wants to focus on? Actually, as a national organisation, Railway 200 has been quite open to this and saying, well, there were bad bits of the past, and we shouldn't kind of gloss over them and overlook them. So I've been, as I say, very, very pleased by what we've been able to do and what we've been able to put out into the public domain and share, that does kind of say, well, we need to think a bit more about what it was like to work on the railways.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Nathan, as well. It's always so good. We love it, don't we, in our podcast? We end up talking about so many different topics that it's a massive learning treat for us to discover all these new areas of family history that we can explore. So if anybody'd like to explore Mike's database, so it's Dr Mike Esbester, and his website is www.railwayaccidents.port.ac.uk. And that's the main place to go and learn about the project. And as he says, hopefully not find your ancestors in there, because it means something's gone awry. But on the other hand, if something has gone awry, it's good to learn about it.
Just to add to that, thinking about the context side of things, even if you can't find, you had a railway ancestor, but they didn't have an accident, or you can't find them in the database, you'll probably find someone who did their job in there. So even if it's not your ancestor, you get some sense of, by looking at that record and the details around that person, what that person was doing, because it's railway work was going to be fundamentally similar across companies, so you'll get an idea about the sorts of things that your ancestor might have been doing day to day. And that's what's quite revealing about some of the accident records is they don't give the idealized company kind of official version of what they should have been doing. They give what they were actually doing, and that's sometimes very different, and kind of really, I think, again, gets down to that human level is wonderful to be able to see and think, Yeah. If I was in that situation, I probably would have taken that shortcut too. Because otherwise, it's really difficult to do what you're being asked to do in the time you got to do it. So there's loads of detail in there, and about that context, even if your particular ancestor isn't in there.
That definitely sounds like a rabbit hole, doesn't it, Nathan?
It sounds lovely. I really want to get lost and find something quite dramatic.
Yeah. I think you're going to. Nathan's family tree is always really annoying. He thinks nothing's going to happen, and then he always gets the best stories. So I just know you're going to find something. I'll put money on it, Nathan.
Let us know if you do.
Yeah.
Will do.
Yeah, we will do. We definitely will do. Yeah. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks.
mate.
Thank you.